The sun was already scorching the small town of Blue Ridge as Richard Nelson's car pulled into the parking lot of the Blue Ridge Police Department. It was a small city nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, a quiet place where gossip flowed easily and secrets were buried deep. To an outsider, the town appeared idyllic: clean streets, well-kept homes, and a slow, easy rhythm to life. But beneath this calm exterior, Richard knew, a storm had been brewing in the department for years. Richard had spent 20 years working his way up through law enforcement. He had seen it all: crimes committed by citizens, crimes committed by officers, and the tangled web of corruption that could swallow a department whole. As a black man in a predominantly white profession, he had fought for every inch of recognition, respect, and authority. But now, at the age of 42, he had been appointed as the new police chief of Blue Ridge, a department that had seen its fair share of scandals and murmurs of misconduct. It was his job to clean up the mess. But Richard had a unique approach. He didn't want to be handed a pristine view of his officers. He wanted to see them as they truly were. That's why he had chosen to come to the precinct undercover on his first day, dressed as an ordinary man, hoping to slip by unnoticed and observe his officers without the protective masks of their uniforms or the facade of professionalism that always accompanied a new chief's arrival. He had no intention of making a grand entrance. Richard wanted to see what was really happening inside the department: the raw, unfiltered truth. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, Richard looked like just another passerby, someone who didn't belong to the world of law enforcement. His choice of attire was deliberate. He was hoping to fade into the background. He didn't want anyone to know who he was, not yet. He wanted to watch, to listen, and to observe. As he stepped out of his car and into the oppressive heat of the August morning, he glanced around. Officers were milling about the parking lot, some exchanging pleasantries, others deep in conversation. Richard could already feel the tension in the air. He was no stranger to the undercurrents of a department in turmoil: the whispers of corruption, the misconduct complaints that never seemed to go away. It was all there, just beneath the surface. He didn't rush inside. Instead, he stood for a moment, breathing in the humid air and collecting his thoughts. The weight of his mission was pressing on him. He had a duty to the community, to the men and women under his command, and to himself to root out the issues plaguing this department. But it wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. He could already feel the resistance in his bones. He had seen it before in other departments. Officers who didn't want change, who were comfortable in their ways and didn't want to be challenged. Richard wasn't naive. He knew he was walking into a lion's den. But he was ready. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, taking one last look around before heading toward the side entrance of the building. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice the small talk among the officers. Some of them smiled at him, but he could tell they weren't really paying attention. He wasn't part of their world, not yet. But that was fine. He preferred it that way. The moment Richard entered the building, the first thing that hit him was the noise. The buzzing of radios, the ringing phones, the low hum of conversations and laughter. It was chaotic, but familiar. This was the environment he had spent decades navigating. He paused for a moment, surveying the scene. Officers were gathered in groups, chatting about their cases, talking about personal matters, and letting off steam. The casual, almost nonchalant attitude was palpable. But there was something else beneath it. An unease, a discomfort that Richard could feel even in the air around him. He wasn't sure what it was yet. But he knew something wasn't right. He wandered deeper into the precinct, trying to blend into the background as best he could. As he walked past the officers, he overheard snippets of conversations, nothing alarming on the surface. But Richard had learned to read between the lines. He knew when people were being too relaxed or when they were trying to cover something up. And then he heard it, a voice loud and mocking cutting through the noise. "Hey, you lost or something?" Richard turned toward the sound, and there stood an officer, a white man in his late 20s, wearing a casual uniform. His posture was arrogant, almost dismissive. He looked Richard up and down with a smirk on his face, clearly assuming that Richard was some kind of outsider, someone who didn't belong. Without a word, the officer took a step forward and spat directly in Richard's face. The room fell silent. For a moment, time seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Richard stood motionless, staring at the officer. The spit clung to his cheek, dripping down toward his chin, but he didn't react. His heart was pounding in his chest, but outwardly he remained calm. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment when he would have to decide how to handle the ugliness he knew was festering within this department. The officer who had spat in Richard's face looked at him, still wearing a smug expression, convinced that he had just encountered some nobody who wasn't worth his time. But that wasn't the truth. Not by a long shot. Slowly, Richard wiped the spit from his face with the back of his hand. The officers around him were watching now, their eyes darting from him to the man who had just disrespected him. Richard's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Did you just spit in my face?" The officer blinked, confused. He hadn't expected any kind of response. The smug smile began to fade from his face as he realized something was off. He opened his mouth to say something, but Richard didn't give him the chance. "I am Richard Nelson," Richard continued, his voice louder now, commanding attention. "Your new police chief." The room went dead silent. The officer's face drained of color as the realization set in. His arrogance faltered, and his eyes widened in horror. The other officers, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, now seemed to hold their breath. The officer who had spat in Richard's face took a step back, stammering, unsure of what to say. He had just disrespected the new police chief, a black man, and he knew there was no coming back from this. Richard could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him. It was about the entire department. It was about the culture that had allowed this officer to think he could get away with such an act. It was about the unchecked behavior that had become normalized in this precinct. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. The officer who had spat on Richard stood frozen, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. The other officers looked between each other, unsure of how to react. They had all witnessed something that would change everything, something that shattered the illusion of control and authority they had once held. Richard didn't wait for anyone to speak. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence behind him. He didn't need to say anything else. The message had been sent. But as Richard stepped outside, he knew this was only the beginning. He had just exposed the true nature of the department, something that would take more than a single incident to fix. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that no one wanted to talk about. Richard Nelson wasn't just the new police chief. He was the one who was going to change things, no matter how hard it got, and the officers of Blue Ridge would soon learn that they couldn't hide behind their uniforms or their biases any longer.